Thanks very much, Claudia. Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you a bit about climate change impacts, and particularly I'd like to put them in the context of some of the many other big challenges that we face going forth into the next several decades. And this work is work that we've done in partnership with many other colleagues here at IFPRI and in the other CGIAR centers. Oh, there we go. Thank you. With colleagues in many other of the CGIAR centers as well as other research institutes around the world. Are we all set now? Good. Okay. So climate change is obviously our focus, but it takes place and its impacts are felt in the context of many other big challenges. Globalization is a challenge. Deglobalization is a big question mark these days. Changes in income, where people live, what they eat, innovations in how we produce food and how we distribute food, growth in different economies and so forth. These are all things which pose their own opportunities as well as challenges. Some of those amplify things that we're going to feel with climate change. Some of those work in different directions. But it's important to keep our discussion about climate change in the context of these other big drivers because they all present fundamental changes in the decades ahead. Looking at the big picture, this is a graphic from a paper by Hans Schellenhuber and others in Nature Climate Change last year after the Paris Agreement. And what they show in the gray bar that goes across are the range of the Paris Agreement targets, 2 degrees or less increase relative to pre-industrial levels. And so that's the axis that you see on the left-hand side. Changes in temperature, global mean temperatures relative to late 1800s, basically. And what they show, the vertical bars are different big Earth system processes that will be triggered by different levels of climate change. So on the far left, WAIS, West Antarctic Ice Sheet, melting. Coral reefs, Amazon rainforest, El Nino cycles, different big processes that will be triggered by different levels of climate change. And those are all tremendously important, tremendously interesting, but what's missing here are what are the impacts on agriculture and food systems, which is our principal concern. It's interesting, if you look at the history of agriculture, the entire human history of the domestication of plants and animals occurs in this particular range. That goes back 10,000 years, but it's all in a relatively narrow range in terms of global averages. That's our experience with producing crops and livestock. On the far right, these things labeled RCPs, those are different emission pathways, different assumptions about how rapidly temperatures are going to increase looking into the centuries ahead, from a very optimistic 2.6 to a very pessimistic 8.5. And unfortunately, we're actually more likely to end up at the upper end of that range than the lower end. So well beyond our experience historically in terms of producing crops and livestock. Just for further context, what I've labeled as green revolution, but really the last half century of scientific research and investment in improving crop varieties and yields and pest and disease resistance and so forth, all of that occurs in a very tiny window within this historical range. So you can see that what we're facing is well beyond the experience that we have, and that poses great challenges in terms of preparing so that we're ready to handle those kinds of changes. One example of the diversity of impacts, which they're going to be felt very differently in different regions, by different types of producers, for different commodities. Here are just one example in terms of changes projected in food prices for maize and for wheat between now and the middle of the century, 2050. Looking at maize first on the left-hand side, the bottom line, the black line, is what we would expect in the absence of climate change. So that's price increases that are a result of growth in population, changes in income, and so forth. The whole band, the gray area above that, are different projections based on how rapidly climate changes, how rapidly temperatures increase, and also based on different models that are used to make those projections. So one thing, tremendous uncertainty. Second thing, they're all up, at least in the case of maize. Looking at wheat, on the other hand, smaller increases, and that's because wheat is also affected by climate change, but there tends to be a greater balance between areas that benefit and areas that are adversely affected. But the general point is that there's no single message in terms of impacts. It's going to vary tremendously depending on context. Quickly to show results of projections about impacts on hunger. That's one of our main interests here at IFPRI, looking ahead to 2030, and that's the time frame for the Sustainable Development Goals. Depending on whether we look at climate change or not, depending on whether we consider different types of responses or not. The bars, the vertical bars, are measured on the left-hand axis. Those are numbers of people at risk of hunger. And the blue bar there shows at the world level about 800 million people today. We project in the orange bar that that number would fall to about 500 million by 2030 in the absence of climate change, but climate change reverses or offsets some of that progress, bringing it back up to about 600 million people in 2030. We can do something about it. In this case, the last bar, it's called 2030 COMP. That stands for a comprehensive investment scenario involving investments in agricultural research and development, improved infrastructure, improved resource management. Those can actually bring us back down and put us back on track for further improvement. But they come at a cost. And you see also that those impacts vary across different regions in terms of numbers as well as in terms of the share of population at risk of hunger, and that's measured by the different colored circles. They're all dropping. You see in most areas of the world it's coming down to around 5% of the total population, with the exception of Africa south of the Sahara, which has special challenges. These are some of the investment scenarios that I mentioned. And without going into detail, we look at different time periods, in this case 2030 and 2050. We look at different types of outcomes, whether it's production or food security or greenhouse gas emissions or water use. And on the left-hand side, we can look at different types of investments. The top rows, the ones that are called, that have R&D in the label, are different variations of investment in agricultural R&D, the levels of investment, where they're regionally focused, and so forth. Another set looks at irrigation and other types of water management. A third set, RMM, reduced marketing margins, means improvements in infrastructure that help farmers have better access to markets, both for inputs and also for the outputs that they produce. And the bottom line, comprehensive, brings together several of those other elements. Without going into the numbers, we highlighted in green and in brown just areas that show greater improvement or less improvement. And you can see overall a lot of improvement as a result of agricultural R&D, but it takes time. It's a long-term investment between the development, the innovation, the dissemination, and so forth. Working all the way down to the bottom, a comprehensive investment scenario, you have a lot of progress in lots of areas, some of it fairly quickly, but it comes at a high price tag. So there are important challenges and trade-offs that we face in addressing the issue of climate change. Time is short, so let me just quickly go ahead to some key messages. Over the next several decades, while climate change impacts are already being felt, population growth, income growth, urbanization, some of these other socioeconomic trends are still going to be the principal drivers of changes in food markets that we see. There will be improvements in food and nutrition security, but climate change is going to slow that progress. Impacts will vary a lot depending on resource conditions, market conditions, and on choices that we make, not only individually as consumers and producers, but as a society, as policy decision makers and so forth. Investments, some of the ones that we've looked at, can do a lot in helping to offset the impacts that we see, but there's a lot more that we need to know in a context-specific way about specific options, policy tools, technologies, and so forth. And I think that's where I'll hand it off to Alex, and he'll tell us a bit more about some of those options. Thank you.